Is Star Wars Attack of the Clones the worst love story of all time? It's certainly up there. But let's find out for ourselves, shall we? Alright, in my continuation of the Star Wars prequels aren't that terrible list, I'm continuing with Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Now, alright, I will admit the love story in this is not the strongest, and it's very much not the best written. But, one thing I will give it is that I think it is definitely better than Star Wars Episode 1. Now, given I kind of am a little bit biased here because this was my childhood Star Wars. This was the Star Wars that I always used to watch when I was a kid because my mom wasn't into Star Wars, so she never got us the original trilogy until a little bit later, and we never watched Episode 1 because she didn't really know any better. I mean, it does say 2 on the box, but I guess she didn't figure that out. But, anyway, regardless, this was the episode I watched over and over, and I remember it like that. For the most part. Now, one thing I like about this episode is that it jumps into the action a little bit quicker than Episode 1. So, if you look at it from the beginning, and the initial conflict in the movie is that Padme Amidala is, now, she's being threatened to be killed. Apparently they don't need her to sign a treaty, but instead it's different because, as they reveal in the opening crawl, Senator Amidala, as she is called now, she is no longer the queen, she's the senator. She is the key to this vital vote in order to, I don't know, what is the whole thing about? Oh, right, build a clone army, or make some sort of army of the Republic to defend against this group called the Separatists. But now, wait a minute, didn't we just get introduced to the Trade Federation? Now we're all of a sudden introduced to these Separatists and this guy called Count Dooku? I'll get to that in a second. But it starts off very differently. Now they want to kill the queen. And for some reason, the senator, it gets a little more interesting, though. I don't know, for some reason, at least maybe for me, maybe it's just me personally, but it's a little more interesting now that they want to kill her. There's this added level of danger, and it's just a little more interesting. So, as you continue, the first major scene where there's a lot of boring, drawn-out dialogue is when Chancellor Palpatine is now talking to the Jedi and talking about what threat does this pose and what problems there are. Now, it's not really a very memorable scene. In fact, I don't really know what they talk about. Maybe it's just exposition, but it's not that long and drawn out. Then Padme comes in, and Natalie Portman is very different in this movie because she still talks in that we cannot allow this to happen instead of, naturally talking, but she's much easier to understand, and she gets more into character because she's allowed to say things like, I want to find out who's trying to kill me, not like, I request that someone comes to the disposal of the Senate and figure out who is trying. No, she doesn't talk like that. She talks like, I want to know who's trying to kill me, and she's a little more stubborn. You kind of see her stubbornness start in Episode 1, but then it sort of continues in Episode 2, which I kind of like. Then, the introduction of Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen as Obi-Wan and Anakin. Now, here's my biggest issue, and I feel like most people's issue with Episode 2. Hayden Christensen. Now, I think that he was the perfect person to be cast as Anakin. Now, let me explain before any of you shut off this video in a fit of rage. Anakin Skywalker is supposed to be shown how he turns into Darth Vader and how he starts getting more, angry. I admit the dialogue and some of the ways that it's expressed, once again, like referring to the last video, it's all about direction and the dialogue, which aren't exactly the strongest. Hayden Christensen. Let's talk about the good things that Hayden Christensen does, because there are a few, and I'm kind of getting to the more things that he makes me mad as we get later in the video, but let's talk about the good things. He does portray this sort of stubborn and somewhat angry version of Anakin Skywalker, which that's who Darth Vader is. He's a twisted, evil, angry man. So it's good that we kind of got that, because with Jake Lloyd and young Anakin, we didn't really see that. We sort of saw like a more noble character, like a kid who wanted to help, a kid who had these dreams and ambitions and wanted to be free of this terrible life, and who didn't want to leave his mother, who he loved so much. He was more of an endearing character, and I know it's kind of a sharp contrast, but 10 years do pass, so they do kind of explain a little bit the fact that Anakin and Obi-Wan kind of bicker a little bit, because Obi-Wan has changed a little bit, because I think of the stress that it is put on Obi-Wan in order to train who they think is going to be the chosen. So that part of it is good, and other than that, they're assigned as Padme's protectors, which there's a little bit of discussion there, but otherwise, it's very reflective. There's a lot of reflection of the characters, a lot of character development, because the main key, the beginning action scene, and another main key scene, I don't know, of episode 2 is when Padme falls asleep and these two bounty hunters are trying to kill her. Now, they're bounty hunters, so obviously they were hired by someone, because they don't just do this. They do it for a bounty, which is why they're called bounty hunters. So as Padme is sleeping, and as you see, like, the danger that's kind of unfolding, you sort of, it feels a little bit tense. There's a little bit of tension. But not only that, is that they're sort of elaborating on Anakin's character about how he hasn't stopped thinking about Padme, and also has had nightmares about his mother. Now, those are two things that really are, like, a conflict within Anakin. You don't, now, to the film's discredit, they don't really, after this part, they really don't go into Anakin's psyche that much. They more so go into the plot. But let me continue. The speeder chase is a little bit drawn out, but that whole scene, there's a lot of funny, like, bantering back and forth between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and I don't think it's, like, such terrible dialogue. In fact, I used to laugh at it as a kid, and because I laughed at it as a kid, I still laugh at it out, even though I know how ridiculous it is. Like, when Anakin jumps out of the speeder and finds the bounty hunter and tries to kill her, and then when they walk into the bar and Obi-Wan uses the Jedi mind trick on the guy who's trying to sell him Death Stick. That's one of my favorite scenes in any of the prequels, and it's genuinely funny. I don't know, I just love the scene. If you go back and watch it, it's just so funny. And I don't know, as you keep going on, immediately, less than a half hour into the movie, which for a Star Wars movie is pretty good, Star Wars prequel, I should say, you get immediately what the problem is and what exactly they have to do. They establish very quickly that after this bounty hunter is killed by the mysterious bounty hunter, which we all know, hopefully, if not spoiler, Jango Fett, who kills her and then flies away. Now, they establish very clearly that there's going to be a clear two-part story, which is fine because they establish it, which consists of Anakin taking care, watching over Padme and protecting her on her home planet of Naboo with R2-D2 as, like, their guide, and Obi-Wan Kenobi going to figure out who this killer exactly is. And it's a very good setup. Although it's not executed in the right way, you gotta give them credit for the fact that Padme and Anakin are both shown as very stubborn characters, and Anakin is very stubborn in the way that he wants to be very powerful, and he wants people to understand where he's coming from, and he wants to be more independent, and be thought of as a Jedi, which is what he wanted to be, and it's taking him too long, and he has this lack of patience. Whereas Padme is a very noble character who wants to know who's killing her, and really wants to be, is headstrong on figuring out who this guy is and facing him herself. And because we already saw from the last movie, she is very committed to helping her people and making sure that the world is a better place and that she is not the one that's causing a problem. And like I said, she's the one who has the crucial vote in the Senate to pass whatever law they have to pass. So it's very key that you have the two stubborn characters going together with only a droid that, come on, how much can R2-D2 really influence the characters? And on the other hand, you have Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now, one thing I will praise this movie for, Obi-Wan Kenobi's story is very interesting and it's fun to watch. Let alone if it's better than the original. We all know that the prequels are not better than the originals. And if anyone wants to debate in the comments about that, go at it. I'm just saying, in my opinion, and I'm going to review the original trilogy and say what I like about it, but also say what I don't like about it. But it is more well accepted, in my opinion, or in my experience, that the originals are more or less better than the prequels. But for the prequels, and for what they're trying to get across, honestly, Obi-Wan's story is very interesting. He goes to this alien called Dex, and figures out where this little dart that killed the bounty hunter came from. But not only that, is there's sort of a mystery to this, because the planet, when he goes into the Jedi archives, don't exist. And he has to consult Master Yoda, and then goes there himself to find that there is a planet there, and there is a planet that's kind of off the charts. But then there's sort of like this confusion, but there's supposed to be confusion. There's confusion in the Star Wars prequel that's actually supposed to be there. Because these giant lizard things, called Kaminoites, I assume, they speak to Obi-Wan as if they expected him coming, and they start to talk and banter about this stuff that we had no idea what's going on. But for the first time in a Star Wars prequel, the character doesn't know what's going on either. So it's interesting because you actually figure out what the heck the confusion is, as opposed to Episode 1, where you just kind of have to sit back and accept the confusion. And Obi-Wan starts to figure out that they're building this clone army, and that someone authorized a clone army to be built for the Jedi, when the Jedi never authorized a clone army being built. And then he meets this bounty hunter called Jango Fett, and it kind of leads to this mystery combined with action when Obi-Wan fights Jango Fett. Because honestly, I really like that whole fight scene and the whole experience on Kamino. It's fun for people from the who like the original trilogy, and people who are into the classic Star Wars, that see Slave One and see Boba Fett as a kid, and just how untrusting he already is of Jedi, and sort of have like a tiny little backstory to Boba Fett, if not that much. But it's really rather interesting. Then, unfortunately, we have to go to the romance part of it. We kind of go back and forth. It is balanced, so I don't really hate it too much, but there's far too many scenes with Anakin and Padme falling in love. It's just them having playful banter back and forth. But there are two whole scenes where it's just about the issue at hand that really you don't need to know in order to know what's going on. There's not as much as there was in Episode 1, but there is a little too much of, okay, we get it. Padme's trying to be killed. Anakin needs to protect her. They want to fall in love, but they can't. He's a Jedi. She's a senator. It just goes on and on and on. And then one scene that particularly bothers me is the one where they're eating right after they have separated from Obi-Wan, and they're eating and they're discussing the problem at hand. There's really no purpose to it being there, in my opinion. Like, the only thing that I thought was remotely significant is when Anakin starts to try to bend the rules, and you sort of started to see him twist the rules of whether Jedi are allowed to love. He says they're allowed to be compassionate. So he says that, let's say, you're encouraged to love. In his mind, the Jedi encourage him to love, and he's sort of like kind of bending the rules, even though he knows that Jedis aren't supposed to fall in love and get married. He's sort of bending the rules, but otherwise, it's not really that significant. Then they go to Naboo and talk to the new queen, and it just sort of kind of goes on to being nothing. The scene that I think is the most important, and the scene that I think is supposed to be there, other than the scene where they start kissing, because honestly, people view that scene as cheesy, but if you look at other movies where they're just sort of talking, it's sort of like a very... Let me start over. I feel like I'm bantering a little too much. In the scene where Anakin and Padme kiss for the first time, when they're on Naboo and they're looking out into the water and Padme's telling them about her childhood, they're sort of expanding on their past a little bit and sort of like just talking. As much as forced and as badly directed as it is, you gotta give it credit for sort of talking as like people would these days, except in a different style. If you modernize the dialogue, it would sort of be like a romance that everybody loves to hear today, where two people are kind of talking about random things, but it's like, oh, but that's how people fall in love. They talk about random things. But, I mean, to be fair, people who say that are also criticizing the Star Wars films when they kind of do the same thing. And obviously there's a little bit of cheesy scenes, like when Anakin's riding that creature in the field, and then when they go and eat dinner and he uses the Force to bring the pear to her. Yeah, that scene is a little bit bad, but the scene that I feel is the most important, but also the most forced, ironically, is the scene that when they're in the bedroom together and he's talking to her in like the light of the fireplace and talking to her and like sort of being like this whiny, like making these weird facial expressions about how he feels about her. But if you actually listen to it, it's actually pretty interesting. But the problem is, the acting is so atrocious that you can't get into that part of it. And then in the other scenes, the dialogue is okay and the acting is okay, but they're so unnecessary that you don't want to listen to them because you know that it's just, there's completely no purpose to them. So that's kind of my rant about the love story. But I'm going to kind of continue because honestly, as the story progresses, aside from the atrocious acting and the atrocious direction, the story itself is actually very interesting. They go back to Tatooine because Anakin's having nightmares about his mother. Now this is when it starts to get more interesting, the Anakin and Padme side of the story. It's no longer about the romance anymore. It's about Anakin and his mother. And this is where it gets interesting. Because they sort of revisit a lot of things from other movies, which I think is interesting, and I think it's sort of fun to watch to kind of have your brain being triggered, like, oh, hey, I remember that from this movie, I remember that from this movie, when they go back and visit Watto, and he finds out that Watto has sold Anakin's mother. So when he sells Anakin's mother as a slave, he sells her to a moisture farmer called Cliegg Lars, and they go to the moisture farm only for people to realize, hey, that's the moisture farm that Luke lives on. So there's a little bit of backstory there. They talk a little bit, but it's not overly used dialogue. They get to the point, they meet C-3PO, talk to C-3PO about how Anakin created him, Anakin made him, and now he's returned. Sort of like a little heartfelt moment, but that's quick, because quickly C-3PO escorts them inside. They meet Owen and Beru, who are Luke's step-aunt and step-uncle, but they're really his aunt and uncle. Anakin's stepbrother, and then his girlfriend, Beru. So, but that part of it isn't even, the dialogue isn't even that bad, because then the father comes in, explains to Anakin that he's his stepfather, and explains what happened to his mother. He explains it very quickly, very to the point, with a little bit of emotion, kind of a little bit of like thought process here, how he lost his leg, and kind of a little bit of like, it gives a little bit of emotion to it. But Anakin quickly gets up and says he wants to go after his mother. It's very quick. Obviously, then they go back and forth to Obi-Wan, but I'll get to his story in a second. He goes, finds his mother tied up, and she tells him, well, almost tells him that she loves him, and then dies. Now, aside from, once again, I feel like a broken record, the terrible direction and the terrible acting, this is actually a pretty well done scene. And honestly, I think Hayden Christensen's whining helps him in this scene and the next. The scene in which he finds his mother, goes into this fit of rage. You really see him start to have this anger inside of him, kills all the Tusken Raiders, and then goes back, buries his mother, and says sort of a little eulogy. But the eulogy is that he wasn't strong enough to save his mother. It wasn't this, I appreciate all that you've done for me, I'm sorry. It's, he blames it on himself, and he puts this guilt on him. And honestly, I was watching this yesterday with my little brother, and I didn't realize how smart my 9-year-old little brother was, because he started bawling after all of this stuff happened. But what he really started crying about, and what I feel, now that I reflect on it, is really the part that's such a good part, is when he asks Padme why she had to die. He starts fixing things. It's sort of his coping with his mother. Like, certain people do certain things after a parent or a loved one's death. His thing is fixing things. He sort of asks Padme why she had to die. It's sort of like that typical reaction, but then it goes to anger. It doesn't really go to sadness. He sort of goes in this fit of rage and how he killed all the Tusken Raiders. And you think, oh, the Sand People, they're such monsters. But then he says how he killed the men and the women and the children. And you really see this image in your head of him killing, like, actual men, women, and children. But really, they're Tusken Raiders, which you really don't think of. They're kind of like animals. And, God, I don't know. I just love that scene. And obviously, Hayden Christensen's bad acting really ruins the moment of that scene. But then it sort of continues in this step-by-step process of denial, kind of coping a little bit, but then goes to sadness, but quickly to anger, and to him blaming himself, and then proclaiming to Padme that he promises he's going to be the most powerful Jedi, and he's never going to let anyone die ever again. Once again, another setup. But as we move forward into the rest of the movie is great. I mean, I love it. I could watch the last third of the Star Wars Episode 2 just forever, just for the mere action and the mere, like, conclusion of it. You've already set up what's going to happen. You found the clones. Obi-Wan has communicated with the Jedi, and Anakin, you sort of see how angry Anakin is. He promises Padme he's never going to lose anyone again. But then you just get this fun rest of the movie, because Obi-Wan sends a transmission to Anakin to transmit to Coruscant about the information that he's received after he chased down Jango Fett and followed him to the planet of Geonosis. Obi-Wan gets captured. There's a little bit of dialogue between Dooku and Obi-Wan, and a little bit between Dooku and the rest of the Separatists, but one thing I like about this is that I'm kind of skipping ahead and kind of comparing it to Episode 3, but if those of you who have seen Episode 3, you have the Emperor and his kind of taunting and manipulation of Anakin. You also have the manipulation of Luke Skywalker in the originals, if you've seen that. But when Count Dooku tries to explain to him that he's good, he's not explaining to Obi-Wan that he's trying to turn Obi-Wan to the dark side. He wants Obi-Wan to join him, and he wants Obi-Wan to try to destroy the Sith. And he's not saying join me and become a Sith Lord. He's saying we can destroy the Sith together, which is honestly how the Sith continue to go, because they kill the Master and there's a new apprentice. But Obi-Wan doesn't falter. He glares at him and he says, I'll never join you, which really, it shows the strong character of Obi-Wan Kenobi, which that's another part that I like. But anyway, continuing, Yoda goes to supervise the clones and see what is going on in Kamino. Well, Mace Windu and the rest of the Jedi are going to go rescue Obi-Wan. Anakin and Padme don't listen to Mace Windu, and they take 3PO and R2 and go to rescue Obi-Wan. The droid factory scene I love, just for the mere excitement of it and for the mere design of it. I just love the look. It just looks visually so fantastic that I just love it. Padme and Anakin get separated. They're in certain danger. You really see R2 legitimately fly for the first time, and like, hell, honestly, now that I think about it, I think it's the first time you see R2 fly, and the first time you see it, it's like, whoa, what's going on here? He saves Padme, and it's sort of like, it's just this cool, it's an interesting scene. They have a little comic effect about how 3PO gets his head knocked off, and his head goes into a battle droid body, and the battle droid head goes onto his body, and then you kind of see where it leads to. Dooku then captures Anakin and Padme, and then there's this great arena fight. Once again, I don't really have anything to say for it, like, analytically. It's just this great scene. It's this big fight scene, this big exciting scene, cleverly done. You kind of see how powerful Anakin and Obi-Wan are, and that they're not to be underestimated. And it's just this fun little scene. Then you have, like, that rescue scene where you, like, smile and, like, yes, the Jedi are here once Mace Windu arrives. But then, once again, they're surrounded again. And then you see, wait a minute, these battle droids aren't really what they're all cracked up to me. That's actually danger. Only to have Yoda arrive with all the clone troopers. And then it's sort of this, like, climactic ending to a setup movie, which I do give credit to. This is much more exciting, with the exception of the sword fight, than Episode 1. Although, once again, you get a 2-on-1 sword fight between Anakin and Obi-Wan and Count Dooku. Yeah, there's no two-bladed lightsaber, but hey, they fight him. You realize that Dooku's not one to be messed with, and then they kind of make up for the fact that there's no double-edged lightsaber, because Yoda comes in and fights Count Dooku, and all of a sudden, it's the first time you've ever seen Yoda wield a lightsaber before, and it's shocking, it's very well done, and just well thought out, and like, just, I don't know, well executed in terms of the action, and they really tie it all together with what these films are the strongest for, the action and the visual effects. So, honestly, if I look at this and I remember all of the great scenes and the great things about it, look, I mean, they have it on the back. They got it on the back. Yoda is on the back, wielding a lightsaber. So, then, toward the end, it's sort of more of a setup. It's kind of a slow ending, not really as happy and joyous as the others, but you hear Yoda say the Clone Wars have finally begun. You're thinking, finally! The war has actually started. There's actually a war going on. Finally! And you sort of see at the end Dooku kind of talking to his mysterious master, which some of us have figured out is Chancellor Palpatine, and you sort of see the Separatists meet. You see the Death Star, actually, Dooku shows a hologram of the Death Star, and it's like, oh my god, that's the Death Star, it's so cool! And then it sort of ends kind of softly a little bit, with the Chancellor looking out on his clone army, this army of the Republic. Jar Jar Binks has granted power, emergency power, all to the Chancellor, so way to go, Jar Jar Binks. Although, without Jar Jar, we wouldn't have gotten the Empire, so I guess we kind of have to thank him. But anyway, regardless, and then it ends with Anakin and Padme's secret marriage, which they proclaimed that they weren't going to do. Now they are going to do, and now it's this new sort of issue, which it kind of doesn't really end off as a cliffhanger. It just sort of says the war's begun. Now we have to see where the wars actually started. And now, then we finally get to Episode 3, the good Star Wars prequel. Because honestly, I can measure up Revenge of the Sith, as much as it still is confusing and you can still see how it's still a prequel and it's kind of a wannabe of the original trilogy. That is the only one that measures up to the original trilogy in my mind, in story and structure and characters, as well as visual effects and, you know, CGI and all the lightsaber fights. But I don't even want to talk about Episode 3 now because I have so many good things to say about it that that's going to be my next video once I do watch it. Yep, that's my review of Episode 2. Don't judge it too harshly. Honestly, I gotta say, if you are really someone who doesn't really like the prequels that much, but does enjoy watching them, I would say, if you're more annoyed with all of the diplomats and bureaucrats and really the political aspects of Star Wars, if that's the thing that pisses you off the most, I would watch Episode 2. And if the love story is what pisses you off the most, hey, I would watch Episode 1. And hey, you know what? You can skip around. Watch scenes on YouTube. Just watch the movie once and then enjoy it for what it is. Because, honestly, I could watch the movies the whole way through and have them be bearable, knowing that there's problems with them, and honestly, just knowing that they're part of a saga and they're not as terrible as people say. And they do get better, in my opinion, as they go on. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video, which will be Revenge of the Sith.